Do you ever get frustrated when you feel someone is not listening to you? Perhaps it's a child or a spouse. Maybe it's your boss at work or possibly even a politician. Whatever the case, we all have those times when we wonder if the other person is actually listening to what we have to say. If you're like me, I'm sure you have also been accused at some point of not hearing or listening. Well, when King Hezekiah and the southern kingdom's backs were against the wall, they wondered if God would listen to them since they had made so many bad choices in the past. Last week's session from Isaiah chapter 31 focused on the fact that Judah, the southern kingdom, faced a crisis and determined to turn to Egypt for help instead of God. They didn't even seek God for advice before making their decisions. This took place after King Ahaz died and his son Hezekiah became king of Judah. Hezekiah determined to stop paying tribute or protection money to Assyria. Now in chapter 31 we learned that Isaiah warned Hezekiah not to depend on the horses, the horsemen, and chariots of the Egyptians. In chapter 30, Isaiah called Judah rebellious children who carry out a plan, but not God's plan. He says that they made an alliance against God's will and piled sin on top of sin. We'll be looking at chapter 37 today. The alliance with Egypt was a failure, and Assyria, now under the leadership of King Sennacherib, had conquered most of Judah and was poised to conquer Jerusalem. Hezekiah finally realized they had to turn to God. But would God listen? We probably all struggle with whether or not God will listen to our prayers. We will discover that God does hear the prayers of His people and will act to fulfill His purposes and His plans. We begin by examining how Hezekiah responded after receiving a threatening letter from the Assyrian king. We'll be looking at Isaiah chapter 37, verses 14 through 16. Verse 14 begins with this. Hezekiah took the letter from the messenger's hands, read it, then went up to the Lord's temple and spread it out before the Lord. Then Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, Lord of armies, God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim, you are God, you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. You made the heavens and the earth. Notice Hezekiah's response. He took the letter that contained the arrogant words of the Assyrian monarch and spread it out before the Lord and assumed a position of humility before God. Then he prayed. This is how we should respond when we call out to God when our backs are against the wall. We lay out the situation before Him and assume a position of humility, and we begin to pray. Notice the words and phrases Hezekiah used when talking with God in verse 16. First, Hezekiah acknowledged that God is the Lord of armies. Therefore, He was greater than the Assyrian army that was moving toward Jerusalem. Ephesians 6:10 reminds believers to be strengthened by the Lord and by His vast strength. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 3 reminds us that the Lord is faithful. He will strengthen you and guard you from the evil one. He was and is the all-powerful God. Second, Hezekiah recognized the unique relationship Judah had with God by using the term God of Israel. The God of Israel is the same God of those who profess Jesus Christ as God's Son, whom God raised from the dead, as we are told in Romans chapter 10, verse 9. It's a unique relationship that isn't available to those who don't know Christ. Believers today can approach God and acknowledge their special relationship with God through Jesus Christ. Third, Hezekiah acknowledged God's presence with the people of God by stating that God was enthroned between the cherubim. Within the temple's most holy place sat the Ark of the Covenant. Depicted in gold on top of the ark were two cherubim. It was in this space within the temple, just above the cherubim, that God was especially present for his people. Hezekiah was proclaiming that he believed God was present and would hear him. Believers today have the promise of God's presence. We are God's temple, and the Spirit of God lives within us. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16 tells us this. And we have the promise that Jesus will never leave us or abandon us. That promise is in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5. God will hear us because he is present with us. Next, Hezekiah acknowledged the sovereignty of God over all kingdoms and creation by stating that you are God, you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. You made the heavens and the earth. What is true about God is equally true about Jesus, God's Son. Colossians chapter 1, verse 16 through 17 tells us this about Jesus. Everything was created by him in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and by him all things hold together. John chapter 3, verse 35 tells us that the Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hands. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 22 reminds us that Jesus has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers that are all subject to him. God hears our prayers because through Christ we have access to voice our prayers to the God of the universe. After acknowledging the greatness of God, Hezekiah described the enemy's threats in verses 17 through 19. Here's what Hezekiah says. Listen closely, Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, Lord, and see. Hear all the words that Sennacherib has sent to mock the living God. Lord, it is true that the kings of Assyria have devastated all these countries and their lands. They have thrown their gods into the fire, for they were not gods, but made from wood and stone by human hands, so they have destroyed them. Notice that Hezekiah didn't say a word regarding the impending loss of Judah, Jerusalem, lives, or land. He had come to a realization that the battle was not about Judah, was not about him, but was about God. In order to understand this more fully, we must look closely at the message sent to Hezekiah. 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 19 through 35 gives the message in its entirety. After continuing to tear down Hezekiah and repeatedly telling the people, don't listen to him, the message ends with the blatant mocking of God in verses 33 and 35. Verse 33, he says, has any of the gods of the nations ever rescued his land from the power of the king of Assyria? In verse 35, who among all the gods of the lands has rescued his land from my power? So will the Lord rescue Jerusalem from my power? The Assyrian king had called into question the ability of God to protect Jerusalem and compared God to the gods of other places they had conquered. This was the final straw for Hezekiah. He could not let this go any further. He acknowledged that all the other nations' gods were man-made and were perishable. Hezekiah points out to God the obvious, that he should listen and hear what had been said about him. Obviously, God had heard, and he already knew because nothing catches God by surprise. But Hezekiah had not listened. This is what's important. But now Hezekiah was listening and came to the realization that his only hope was in God. He had to come to the point that it was no longer about him or the people of Judah, but it was about God. The current climate in our own country has revealed many negative attitudes and feelings toward our holy God. We see people mocking God and our faith, and we see people mocking God in our faith as Sennacherib did. God is waiting for his church to respond with absolute humility before him and petition him for help. He desires his church to quit worrying about what will happen to them personally and petition God for solutions that will reveal God's true nature, power, and sovereignty. When this takes place, God will be glorified. The blatant mocking of God leads Hezekiah to make a specific request in verse 20. Now, Lord our God, save us from his power so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you, Lord our God, you alone. Even though Hezekiah did ask God to save his people from the Assyrians, he placed this desire in the context of what was most important. He wanted God to save them so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you, Lord, are God, you alone. Hezekiah placed God's glory and reputation above his own needs or even the prosperity of Judah. He did not argue that somehow the people of Judah deserved to be saved based on their character. Instead, Hezekiah argued that if Sennacherib won, God's own reputation would be damaged. The basis of Hezekiah's prayer was God's character, not Hezekiah's own character. And the motivation for his request was God's glory, not his own glory. Whether Judah survived or fell, Hezekiah wanted God to show the world that he does not fail. When you pray, have you ever considered whether your prayer was more focused on what you wanted instead of God being glorified through the situation? Well, God did hear Hezekiah, and he was going to respond. Sennacherib may not have realized it yet, but he was about to get a lesson on what the only true and living God could do. Beginning in verse 21, God outlines how he's going to respond to the prayer of Hezekiah. Part of that response includes how God would help his people in verses 30 through 32. Here's what God says. This will be the sign for you. This year you will eat what grows on its own, and in the second year what grows from that. But in the third year sow and reap, plant vineyards and eat their fruit. The surviving remnant of the house of Judah will again take root downward and bear fruit upward. For a remnant will go out from Jerusalem and survivors from Mount Zion. The zeal of the Lord of armies will accomplish this. The war had obviously taken its toll on the food supply throughout the entire region. Planting and harvesting had been disrupted, destroyed, or thwarted by the Assyrians, which led to starvation. The people of Judah could only watch the destruction helplessly from behind the city walls. God said that within 3 years' time, the agricultural cycle of the land would be back to normal, and all evidence of the presence of the Assyrians would be gone. While the recovery would take a while, the people of God would survive because God listened and responded. But it would take 3 years. How would the fact that God's promise would take 3 years to be fulfilled impact your faith if you were living during this time? What does this communicate to you regarding what we should expect as God works through us today? Verses 33 through 34 describes the outcome for Jerusalem and the king of Assyria. Therefore, this is what the Lord says about the king of Assyria. He will not enter this city, shoot an arrow here, come before it with a shield, or build up a siege ramp against it. He will go back the way he came, and he will not enter this city. This is the Lord's declaration. As mentioned last week, the Assyrian army was never able to conquer Jerusalem. 2 Kings chapter 19 verse 35 confirms that the angel of the Lord struck down 185,000 soldiers, leading to the withdrawal of Assyria before they could ever lay siege on Jerusalem. Finally, we see in verse 35 that Hezekiah's prayer was right on target. God knew Hezekiah's heart, heard his prayer, and simply responded by affirming what Hezekiah had already come to realize. God said, I will defend this city and rescue it for my sake and for the sake of my servant David. The Holy One of Israel would make himself known to Assyria and the other nations, just as Hezekiah had requested. He would also bring deliverance for the sake of his servant David. The Lord had promised David he would provide a descendant on his throne for him. That's found in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 16. While judgment and blessings were all part of the kings in David's line, eventually the lineage of David would produce the promised and perfect Messiah, the Son of God. God would not let the lineage of David be wiped out. The Explore the Bible commentary gives us a great summary of these events. It states Hezekiah's repentance, Sennacherib's arrogance, God's plan for the future, and his concern for his own reputation among the nations all meant that God would act. Assyria would be punished, Judah would be saved, God would be known, God's Son would fulfill his plan. What can you learn from Hezekiah's prayer that will help you as you deal with things that have pinned your back to the wall? When you ask God for help, do you really want God to be glorified first, or do you desire God just to take care of your needs? Like Hezekiah, we should humble ourselves before God and present to Him our needs and concerns. We should do this understanding that the sovereign God of the universe will listen and respond according to His plan, His timing, and His purposes.